Well, welcome everybody to our May Computing Education Research Seminar, and we're delighted to have Cecily Morrison with us from Microsoft Research. I was going to say just up the road, but we're all online, so it's meaningless, and welcome from Maryland and all the other places that you're from. Cecily's going to be talking to us about physical programming inclusive of young children with visual disabilities. Before I hand over to Cecily, I'll just do my normal, if you're a regular, I'll do my normal housekeeping. As I normally say on these events, this is part of a series of seminars with the sort of focus on diversity, equity and inclusion. And we're presenting these in partnership with the Royal Academy of Engineering. Diversity and inclusion is something that's very important to Raspberry Pi Foundation, so we want to be able to offer these range of different aspects, different topics to explore these areas in depth, and we've been doing that over the last few months. We're going to have the normal routine where we have the talk for sort of 35-40 minutes, and then we'll break into small breakout rooms for 15 minutes or so, where we'll think about questions to ask Cecily, and then we'll come back and have a big Q&A. And just, I'm sure I don't need to remind you, you know, we talk about the sort of ground rules that we have. We want to be able to listen to each other, share our experiences, but be very receptive to everybody's point of view. So without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Cecily. She's a principal researcher at Microsoft Research Cambridge. Her recent work has focused on designing inclusive experiences for people who are blind or with low vision. She co-led the team that designed Code Jumper, a physical programming environment, and she's currently engaged in developing assistive agent technology in the Project Tokyo. And we need to congratulate Cecily on being on the latest Queen's Birthday Honours list, I understand. And without further ado, maybe we can swap the screen sharing, and Cecily, you can start sharing your screen. Thank you very much.
Well, great. Well, I'm really pleased to be here. And what Sue didn't say was that Sue was at the beginning, at the start of this adventure that we had in creating a physical programming language, and she's been a guide to us throughout. So I'm going to speak today about physical programming languages inclusive of young children with visual disabilities. And I think the best place to start is a place that let's get our slides going. Here we go. A place that we probably all very familiar with, which is block coding for teaching primary school children to code. Now, probably everyone on this call has tried a block environment. There are lots of advantages. The discoverability of commands, no syntax errors, there are live experiences, creative and imaginative visualizations. But how do you use Scratch if you are a blind or low vision child who cannot see the screen? Well, a first answer might be, well, let's make it accessible. Let's add a screen reader, let's add magnification, let's add keyboard shortcuts. And indeed, there have been attempts to do this. So the image on screen is from Blocks for All, which is a screen-based block language specifically for people using screen reader technology. Apple Swift is another example of this as well. And I've put some access to some of the literature that goes over this, as well as an overview of accessible programming for visual impairment at the bottom of this slide. But what about, this gets us so far, but we had the same idea 7 years ago when we started to look at these challenges. But we found very quickly that there were really significant blockers for taking this approach of just adding assistive technology onto what's already there. So one of the biggest challenges that we saw was that many children in this young age bracket from primary school 7 to 11 years old are not yet proficient with the assistive technology that they need to access a computer. So for example, a blind child to use a computer, they must have mastered touch typing, they must have memorized a long list of keyboard shortcuts, and they have to have a real understanding of the hierarchies of a file system. And this isn't usually achieved till, even with very bright children, to at least the age of 11. So by taking this approach, we already push their ability to access programming off to secondary school. But a second challenge is really coding with assistive technology. So you imagine if you could only hear one line of code or see one line of code at a time. So these young pupils need to be able to quickly relate the lines of codes in their mind. So there's a significant memory demand on them, but there's also, they lack the conceptual cognitive structures. Like if you've not heard of a loop, you don't know what a loop is, it's not something that sits in your mind. How can you then put these one lines of code into something that becomes a loop in your mind? So this is a real challenge. And of course, it's a challenge that adults master, but it's a real barrier for young children. So let's take a short example of what code might sound like to an 8-year-old blind child.
Play E5 for half a beat. End loop.
Así.
Play A5 for half a beat. Play G5 for a quarter beat. Play D5 for 1 beat. Loop 3 times. Play D5 for half a beat. End loop. Play F5 for half a beat. Play E5 for a quarter beat. Play C5 for 1 beat. End thread.
So I would be curious is, how many loops did you hear? How many commands did you hear? So these are some of the kinds of things as we're starting to learn to understand the structure of a program with children that they might need to understand. And it's a challenge for an adult to do that in a linear form. It's an even more of a challenge for a child. And I should mention that the experience is actually quite similar for children with low vision. They have the same problem of just seeing a little bit, but often visually rather than auditorily. So to address the exclusion of these young children from learning to code alongside their sighted peers, about, oh gosh, now it feels like 6-7 years ago, we embarked on Project Torino. And the aim was to create a physical programming language for teaching computational thinking and basic programming skills to children ages 7 to 11, regardless of their level of vision. Because what we had heard from the community of teachers of the visually impaired, what people call QTVIs, is that waiting until these young people could access technology and use a text-based language was a real showstopper to their participation. So a blind or low vision child who started to program at the age of 12 when they got to secondary school was already significantly behind their peers in conceptual understanding. And we were given a number of examples of before we started, of those children just not catching up. They were 5 years behind in the experiences of other children, and they just couldn't catch up. We also started hearing from students, but also from teachers, that they were writing off the computer and computing as inaccessible. But this is a bit ironic because computing is perhaps one of the most accessible careers for a blind or low vision child. So nearly 1% of software engineers are blind or low vision, and 1% of the population is definitely not blind or low vision. So one of our aims was to think about how could we bring down the barrier to getting started with coding to the same age as other children. And in the UK, this is really around the age of 7. So we created CodeJumper. It's a physical programming language. It's created from a hub, which is a big piece you'll see at the top middle if you're looking at the image, and then a set of pods which are connected together to create a program. So each of those pods is a statement in that program. We have different kinds of pods. We have play pods and rest pods and loop pods and selection pods. And they're all connected together to create a flow of a program to capture what the children want to play. And as they put them together and they execute this program, they then hear music, poetry, or other kinds of sound experiences. So the image that you see here has 3 threads, so happening simultaneously with different kinds of pods. And then building on that, we also have a range of ways of changing the parameter values for each of those statements. So for example, there's a single dial, it's the yellow dial, the round one in the middle, for changing the number of times a loop might happen. And we can also then, but for a play pod, we might have 2 of those parameter values, one to change the sound and one to change the duration. So these can be changed directly by manipulating them on the pods. They can also be changed programmatically through the insertions of plugs, which are like little pins that go inside the dials. So for example, you could use a random to get a random sound to play. So let me just play you. I think sometimes the best way to get your head around how does this actually work without touching it, which is a bit hard to do when we're virtual, is to have a video of how watching children using it. Project Torino is a physical programming language to teach children basic programming skills and computational thinking, regardless of their level of vision.
The basic idea is we have a series of pods that you connect together, and each one of those pods represents a statement in a computer program, an action that you want the program to take. And when you execute them, it creates music or plays back a story and some audio feedback for allowing kids to take their first steps in learning how to code.
So that's the end goal, but I'd like to step back a bit and talk a bit about our design journey and some of the key design approaches that we took or discovered in this process. So let me take you back to the beginning. This did not start with an idea that we should create a physical programming language. It started with an outreach event that we had created within Microsoft Research to encourage blind and low vision children to imagine their technological future through learning about the design process. So in this picture, 2 young children are making a device that turns light into sound using an Arduino board. And we use this as the first step to imagining how this could be a core of a technology that was personally useful to each child. So whether it was designing a fashionable hat that controlled the lighting conditions so one child could see, or a robot that runs around an imaginary 100-room castle, determining which rooms have windows, these kids were really imagining the technologies of the future and very specifically their future. So we thought this is great. This is a great start. If these kids can imagine their futures and build their futures, we'll have much better assistive technologies. In the end, we thought our responsibility ended there. But we soon discovered that this workshop was not the end of the story. So soon after the workshop, parents came back to us and they said, oh, my child wants to build their design. They want to code. And so we thought, And this is about 7 years ago, so quite a different time than we have now. We thought, what can we use to enable these children to code? Current block-based languages at the time were not accessible, still not very accessible. And that really drove us on this journey through a number of colleagues at Microsoft Research to say, maybe we can make something that will work. As I mentioned some of the earlier challenges, we first started with the easy route, which was, well, let's just add a screen reader and some magnification. And we quickly found that we knew that we had to make something physical. So as we thought, well, blocks on a screen work really well. So how about blocks on a table? So as you see in the image on the left, we 3D printed blocks. We put pins in them, which would allow you to change the commands. And you can see 2 of our Torino young design team, 2 of the 4 young people that were part of our design team for the whole of the duration of this experience. And they very nicely lined up those blocks in a very nice line against the box. And that was the end of their engagement. And it really quickly taught us that blocks get lined up, they get abandoned. We tried various things for connecting blocks, putting magnets on them, and it just didn't suit what they wanted to do. Magnets fall apart, they get knocked off the table. You can't pick up your program and show it to the child next to you. You cannot experience it in the 3 dimensions of the tactile world. And we understood and came to understand that taking what's on a screen and just making it feelable is not really engaging the hands. It's not a full tactile experience. And that led us on a journey with these children to try and take their expertise as tactile people who experience the world tactilely, people who learn tactilely, and see how could we take this expertise and create something that would excite the hands of all children. So I'm going to play for you another video where we 3D printed a whole bunch of interesting parts of things they could hold as a start of that exploration of what would be a great thing to excite their hands that would be the basis of what we did.
Chip away.
Awesome.
And so what makes a sound movement that it do though?
I'd like to use
The one with the button?
Yeah.
So what you can see in this video is they're holding up and listening to it. They're gently stroking it. They're trying to blow and manipulate it. Some of them with vision are looking at them, but they're all in their hands doing something. That was really where we wanted to be. So this really led us down a route of going from blocks on a table to this notion of beads on a string, a program that you could slot together, pick up, and share with whoever you're coding with. So to make a long story short, we went through 3 iterations of this experience. The first you see in the left-hand corner, you see these round paws that you fit nicely in your hand that's been plugged together. We started there. We then moved in the lower left-hand corner down into something that was more manufacturable. So the pods became the same shape, but we made them tactile in different ways, different kinds of knobs that would be easier to manufacture. And then we moved to our final version, which is in the top right-hand corner, where the pods were fully designed to be manufacturable, to be dropped by children, and all the other kinds of things that you need to think about when designing physical and educational technologies. And in the right-hand corner, you see what's now Code Jumper. The American Printing House for the Blind took on these designs and turned them into a commercial project. Of course, this didn't go also through many interesting hardware challenges as we went from a few hand-soldered prototypes to something that we could manufacture. With the final result being a system that requires about 45 printed circuit boards, 15 different configurations, and 105 plastic parts. So it's a fairly complex system. I'm not going to talk much about the hardware, though I'm very happy to take Q&A questions on that and that process of going from research to something manufacturable. What I'd really like to spend some time with today is talking a little bit about the design principles. So how did we get to this design, and what can we learn about understanding these technologies that will work across vision levels. So I'm going to share with you 6 principles that we explore throughout our design process. So the first one was a persistent program overview. And what I mean by that is that when you listen to a program or when you look at a visual line of text coding or a block program, one block at a time, it's very hard to get a sense of the overall program. So one of the key things in all of our design decisions to make sure that the children could always get a full feeling of what their program did. We found this worked really well. It was particularly useful in the ways they could track what their program's doing, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But it also meant there are then limitations of what we could do. So for example, we never integrated functions because that would require us putting some functionality into a pod that was no longer feelable. They would no longer have a sense of their program. And we decided that that was something that could happen later, because key was that they always knew the structure of their program. But let me share with you a lot of the techniques that were then developed that help children to follow their program as they move through it and connect what their statements were versus what it did.
the rest. There's the end. There's one here.
That was that last thing, right?
So it goes dim dim dim. Pause. Dim 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 dim.
So you can see in that last part of the video as that young girl follows her code while she's listening to it, and then she replays it back in her mind. So she's really connected what those statements are doing and how it works. So trying to build that precise understanding of how code relates to its execution. So certainly at the time that we were doing this, and I know this field is growing rapidly, it was one of the few skills that we knew to promote the progression in coding skills. We also found that teachers really commented on that following the program helped the children understand how the program was executing, but also how and when they could debug it. Our second approach was around liveness. So what liveness means that as soon as you touch one of the pods, you get a response. You always know the state of the pod. It's always responding to you. So that from the minute you start programming, you get a sense of what you've done. Now, this is different to some other kinds of languages where you build your program, the camera takes a photograph of it and then it parses it and then it produces whatever the output being, sound or running a robot or the likes. One of the reasons we chose to go with liveness is we saw very early on in our design process how much it stimulated engagement right from the beginning. It is, of course, requires a lot more technology. So there are implications for that in terms of cost. But we saw that it worked particularly well with young children and particularly well with children who might not easily get into coding. And therefore, it was a hook that then could be brought in to engage them into a larger set of structures of coding. I'm just going to skip one slide and move on to the next one. Our third approach was taking a sort of a feather from the cap of Mitch Resnick and Scratch, was to say, how can we create a low floor and a high ceiling? So we want children to start with very simple programs that help them to understand that a program is a sequence of commands. But we also want people to be able to extend that process up to much more complex programs that cover all of the aspects of the primary or the elementary curriculum. Now, at the time, the only curriculums that were in place were the UK and Australia. So those were, for the most part, our guiding principles. And I'd like to, when we worked with children, we always found this work quite well, but we were always quite taken by any time that we engaged with a software professional, whether they be blind or sighted, they kept saying, oh, I'd like it to do more. I want to extend more. I want to be able to have more creativity. But we actually found that by constraining what the children were able to do, it really enabled them to focus on going deeper into understanding program structure, rather than focusing on getting larger, bigger programs, but not having an understanding of what they do. And we found that we were able to really use the fact that a physical programming by necessity must be not so large, because it will fall off the table, be hard to carry around, be very expensive, really to the advantage of pushing on the notions of various aspects of computational thinking. So in a video that I'm about to show to you, there's a young girl who has been asked to program jingle bells. And she starts out just by trying to plug in one play after another, and she runs out of play pods. And all of a sudden she's then forced to think, how could I do this more efficiently?
Jingle.
Oh dear.
Oh.
That's not going to work.
There needs to be some pauses in here.
Pauses? Think about the words. Jingle bells. Jingle bells.
Just maybe it's with that need to say jingle.
Right, okay. But you haven't got enough for that, have you?
No.
So you're going to have to think a bit more efficiently. How can you make jingle happen 3 times if you haven't got enough beats?
Okay. I got it. She's got it.
So she's got it. She's realized that she needs to create a loop in order to create an effective and efficient program. So our fourth principle was to make something that was going to work across visual abilities. So while we wanted to address the exclusion of blind and no vision kids from learning to code, our vision wasn't one of separate but equal. It was really a vision of inclusive education. So a vision of enabling blind children and their sighted peers to code side by side. So most children with a sensory impairment will be in a mainstream school, and we wanted them to be able to be together. So often, if children are offered an accessible experience, it's either done in a separate room or at the back of the class. We wanted to bring children together, regardless of the level of vision, to code together. And I think a nice example of the success of that is that one of the young children that we worked with early on in our development process was a young boy programming with his schoolmate. And this was the first time in his entire education, and he was, I think, 9 at the time, that he had done anything in the school without a teacher intervention directly supporting accessibility. And this is a lovely story that's grown. This boy is now 14, and his mother was just telling me yesterday that actually his one friend at school now is around coding. They code together, they have a shared interest, and it's enabled him to really connect with another child, which is something that for many visually impaired children is a real challenge in a mainstream school. Now, how we did this, so just to give one example of what this meant for our design, was that we tried to ensure that all the elements were communicated in both a visual and a tactual form. So for example, the pods use color to support those who are using color, including many visually impaired children, but they're also tactually distinct. So the tactual and the visual information are always mixed, and they're never different. And therefore, regardless of what abilities a child is using, they're going to be able to have a shared experience. Now, it was our vision of including children who are blind or low vision, but we also wanted to include children with multiple disabilities or other disabilities in coding education. As part of that process, we found within our trialing, which I'll talk about a bit later, we trialed with about 75 children across the UK. Some of those children had physical disabilities and were able to work well with CodeJumper, but we also found that it worked quite well with children with autistic spectrum conditions. And I think perhaps one of my favorite anecdotes is one of the child using this was in a special school, blind with autism. And they had struggled to engage him in any academic work, but he was happy to do CodeJumper for an hour a week. And then he started to take that debugging process that they were teaching through the CodeJumper sort of scheme of work, and try to use that to solve problems between his CodeJumper lessons. So gave him a vocabulary and an approach to help address some of the day-to-day challenges he had in dealing with a world that didn't do what he wanted it to do. Our fifth one is not only do we need to get kids coding well, coding together, but we also want to enable their progression. So while this is a great tool for embedding programming, basic programming computational skills for young learners, really our ultimate aim was to think about how could we open up careers in technology for people who are blind or low vision. And so we specifically thought about how we could support the progression of children from a physical language to a textual language by enabling them to listen or read their code as they followed its execution.
Play E5 for a half a beat. End loop. Play A5 for a half a beat. Play G5 for a quarter beat. Play D5 for 1 beat. Loop 3 times. Play D5 for a half a beat. End loop. Play F5 for a half a beat. Play E5 for a quarter beat. Play C5 for 1 beat. End thread.
So I didn't introduce the videos. In that video, what you're seeing is they're not playing the actual program execution, but they're reading out the code, and the two boys, one blind and one sighted, are following that code with their hands. So they relate the experience of understanding the spatial tactile experience to what they're going to hear as they move into a text-based language as they get older. So those were some of the key aspects of when we were designing it. And then I'd like to take the last bit of this presentation to talk a little bit about what we found when we tried to evaluate this in a study. This is going to be fairly brief, but again, I'm happy to go into greater detail in the Q&A. So the Torino Beta study. So this was a study that on technology terms was a fairly large scale study. We had 75 children being supported by 30 teachers across 24 localities in the UK. And we sent out to them a Torino kit, which you can see on the left. So it had, I think it's 14 or 15 pods. It had a laptop with the software running and a mat so that there was a high contrast materials. And then there was also a scheme of work that went along that gave them fairly detailed guidance on how to teach. Because our assumption here was that these would be taught by, could be a teaching assistant, could be a teacher of the visually impaired, could be a parent, it could be pretty much anybody. So we didn't want to assume any knowledge of coding. And I've left the reference of the paper that goes in much more detail about what this study is doing. If you want to, I'm not going to go into the details too much. I'm going to focus specifically on the findings. But I do want to mention, just before we get into the findings, some of the considerations and challenges we had when we were thinking about how do we measure and understand success with a disability population. So we had to think about the fact that students are really diverse in their abilities. So we were dealing with children who might be 7, who might be 11, could be dealing with children who might have had some cognitive impairment, or children with different levels of vision, and therefore they might be behind or ahead of the curriculum in different ways. We then were dealing with teachers who are not specialists, and I know that's fairly common across primary school at the moment when it comes to teaching coding, but it was certainly going to be the case here that it was very unlikely that it would be a computing teacher that was teaching. It was going to probably be someone close to the child. And just from a practical point of view, data collection was by researchers. So so data collection by researchers was restricted due to logistics. So to reach the number of visually impaired children we were aiming to, we had to send these out across the country. So we couldn't go and watch and get in the schools and see what they were doing. So we had to think about other ways to capture that notion of learning or understanding that might have taken place. So the approach that we used was to have a validated questionnaire to measure engagement, measurements of motivation as a construct, and then teacher-reported learning outcomes. And again, I think Alex Hadwin-Bennett might be on the call, and heads up to him for having actually done a lot of the design and preparation of this study. So let me go quickly through some of the things that we found to start off a good conversation in our breakout rooms. So what did teachers think? Well, 100% of teachers strongly agreed or agree that they would like to use Torino to teach coding in future. So for the most part, people really got on with it, and they didn't have too much difficulty coping with teaching computing, even though it was new for the vast majority of teachers who were working with it. From a student perspective, we saw a lot of engagement, a lot of words that showed that this was exciting. They were enthusiastic, they wanted to do it. And when we asked them, how excited do you get before a Torino session, we got an average of 4.32 out of 5. So excitement levels were pretty high. But we often judge and assess coding in terms of what people are, do they engage? But of course, really we want to understand is, what impact has it had on their learning? And that's something we'll talk about a little bit later, something quite hard to think about how we do. One way that we thought about it was, could we think about whether their motivation to participate in the field changes? As we know that in other subjects, motivation can be more important than actual skills at this primary school level. So we asked the question, how many stars would you give yourself now for your coding or programming ability? We asked them pre and we asked them post. And what we see is a fairly significant shift from 2 out of 5 stars to 4 out of 5 stars. And we can see that there was a fairly large, significant and large effect size to this. So we can start to see that maybe this is really important. If people start to get excited about coding, that's maybe more important than what they actually learn. But then again, of course, their learning is important too. So we start to open up this question of what do we measure and how do we measure these new kinds of tools? Now, I'm going to dive a little bit more into talking about what did we learn about some of the design approaches that we took. I'm afraid that the lovely images we've had in this presentation will now disappear, as we don't have the rights to show any of the children in the images that we had collected during our research. So we said one of our design approaches was to create a persistent program overview. And we got the response in a fairly across the board of, I should mention that we made good use of the tip relating to tracing the program. For some students, this is really important and aids their understanding. The students felt it and described it. So we saw this as being a fairly key thing to how it wasn't just the language itself, but really that fact that the language enabled a set of techniques that were going to be important in how they came to understand coding and programming. We talked about liveness as well, and this was always a really tricky one for us because liveness, as I mentioned before, you have a cost versus an engagement trade-off. And this comes from a very experienced teacher from one of the schools for the blind, and he said, currently, entry-level environments such as Scratch are either inaccessible to my students, provide very dry feedback, i.e. text-based output that is then read using a screen reader. The same out could be easily achieved using writing in a text editor. The perceived relevance of programming can be lost because of this. And one of the advantages of a product such as Torino is that it provides immediate feedback to the students from the very first plugging in of a playpod. The physical nature of the devices removes some of the abstraction of creating and running a program using an IDE. So this is really what we were aiming for. Could we get that engagement straight off the bat? So a low floor, high ceiling, we found that students went from some of the students who were participating after their 12-week use of the program, they still were creating 3 and 4 sequence programs. These were perhaps our youngest ones for 7, 8, maybe there was potentially some cognitive disability here, up to those who are, in this quote says, the 2 higher level ability learners were creating their own tunes using piano sounds and making use of loops, nested loops, pauses, and variables. They enjoyed having the freedom to try out what they had previously learned. So there was we were able to get quite a differentiated view for different ages and different skill levels. Thinking about whether it worked across visual abilities. It was quite interesting to us, even though that we had been very focused on programming, was that quite a few of the teachers focused almost their entire teacher reported learning and outcomes around collaboration. And this is one example here, and there's a beautiful video, which I'm afraid I can't show you. It says the pupils have worked extremely well together and have helped each other to rapidly pick up many of the concepts and vocabulary used. Here's a video of successful joint working and happy collaboration. This was in this particular district, they had brought the children together across multiple schools into one place to teach them to code all at once. So the children who didn't know each other, but all children who also needed to work a little bit on their social and interaction skills. So in many ways, those design goals held quite well. But one of the things that really struck me as we were going through and analyzing the findings, and again, I would point you towards the paper if you want a much deeper, more systematic dive into the findings, was how different the teacher reported learnings were to the kinds of things that we were thinking about what students would achieve. And I'm just going to highlight 3 quite different categories. So one of those, some teachers really focused on vocabulary, using the correct vocabulary. So one teacher says, when completing the activities, the children now often use the correct key terms, sequence, thread, parameters. So as being non-specialists, they really honed down into the vocabulary and the things that were concepts taught in the curriculum and said, can my student do this? Other teachers went in a very different direction and said, well, they really focused on the development of problem solving in these children. So this particular quote captures part of that. The most noticeable impact on progress has been the development of problem solving skills. During the first handful of Torino sessions, the children struggled to identify where to start when repeating an example task. Now they are quick in identifying roles for each other, tracing and building the sequence of code. And to someone coming more from teaching programming and coding, this seems like a very natural thing, but I think for many of our teachers, they thought about this as problem solving. They thought more of the vocabulary as the thing that became what the students were quote unquote learning. But perhaps the thing that struck me the most was how many of our teachers focused on rather the inclusive education aspects of it. And we had many examples of children engaging and for the first time being in a context of really engaging with their sighted peers. Well, this example on the slide said the students, all with visual impairment from different schools, learned how to work together as a team. So a lot of teachers, although we had focused our attention specifically on subject matter knowledge, a lot of the feedback from teachers was much more about the way we can create inclusive technology environments. So that really got us thinking about what does it mean to think about the role of these kind of new languages and accessible technologies, and inclusive technologies, and how does it that we measure and understand what success looks like. Now I'm at my 40 minutes, so I'm just going to close with saying it was very exciting that American Printing House for the Blind took this on as a product, so it's now available in quite a few countries. So please go see the Code Jumper website if you want to think more about the product side of things. And just a big thank you to the team. This was not something I did by myself. It required a huge range of expertise from sort of user research to hardware engineering to plastics design to software design and building. So it was really a team effort. So thank you to the team. And I will finally close as requested with some questions for discussion. Please feel free to add your own, but here are 4 questions you might want to consider. So question 1, how might a physical programming language help young children without a visual impairment who are struggling to learn using a block-based language? Number 2, what can we learn from the success of students physically following their code? Number 3, how should we measure success of a new programming language? And number 4, physical programming can be exciting, but it's more expensive than software. How can we enable such opportunities? So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much and hand back over to Sue.
Thank you very much, Cecily. Can we just jazz hands or wave or put your little reaction things out, whatever, to say thank you to Cecily? That was great. Really interesting. And without too much ado, we'll go into the breakout groups. And when you go into your breakout groups, there'll be somebody from Raspberry Pi in each group to help facilitate the conversation. And hopefully between your group, you'll be able to come up with 1 or 2 or 3 good questions for Cecily about either related to the questions that she's given you or other points that have come up during as you've been listening to the seminar. Welcome back, everybody, and I hope you had a really good discussion. So I think why don't we you tell me in the chat, I've got the chat open, if you tell me in the chat who is from your group wants to be asked to present your questions, and then I can go around and talk to each group. So I think Tracy says that Samantha is kindly volunteered to shall we start with some of one or 2 of those questions from that group?
Sure, thank you. Our group had a really great and lively discussion around all of the wonderful things we can see this being used for. And some of the questions we came up with were around funding challenges, and would there be a potential to do like a collaborative group buy or purchase where multiple schools could go in together. And then similarly, maybe training opportunities for people on how to use this in their classroom and best practices. And then our last question was ideas on how to make computer science more accessible as a career. So those were our 3 questions that we came up with.
Wow, 3 at once. Cecily, do you want to take them in any order?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to ask the first one to. I thought you might be asking the Raspberry Pi Foundation about funding things, or others. I think, yeah, I guess we haven't worked on the commercial side of things. You know, physical languages are more expensive, and I think there should be. I personally see a lot of potential for the way of thinking about sort of libraries of things where you can share and you can borrow and they can pass between. Making that work in practice in this country would be an interesting discussion, but perhaps not led by me, but perhaps maybe by some of the people here who are more into that. I know in the US, and APH has a bigger presence in the US, they have worked quite closely with libraries, like book libraries, and thinking about how they bring tools to people in a wider range. But I think there's generally a lot to be thought about here, but I'm afraid I'm not the right person to answer that question. So that was funding and schools going together. What was the second one? Maybe one at a time would be good.
Sure, sorry. Training opportunities.
Sure. Again, I think there's a whole set, at least for CodeJumper, there's a Microsoft educator community and a whole set of trainings that go with it. I can see we could get more to the more general. I suspect that I think of these new kinds of technologies, it's not just, often they're being used by non-specialists. So it's about how do we get non-specialists confident and comfortable in teaching something they might be learning alongside a student. And we felt the scheme of work was really essential in doing that. And again, that's been set up on the Microsoft educator community. So all those lessons are available. And I know APH are doing more than what we did. I think that's, as we start to see new technologies coming out, I think that's going to be a critical part of actually making them functional. I think that role was often taken on by teachers previously, but I'm not sure that that's always going to be the most practical way as we go forward. In terms of other training opportunities, again, I'm not sure I have much more to say on the specifics. Again, APH run a whole bunch of trainings that are available to people. I think what's specific about a physical language, and it's often an interesting challenge online. So I trained a whole bunch of people in Japan, for example, and it was quite a challenge, even with our great technology at Microsoft Research, big screens and cameras everywhere, actually trying to understand how the physical relationship of the body is to the program language and how children move and how you can help them move. And use their bodies to take on that learning experience. So I think that's one of the interesting challenges of what's likely to be a virtual training for something which is definitely not virtual. And your third question was around how do we make computing science careers more accessible? Oh, that's a very big topic. So I guess the biggest resources that I would point to would be the CREATE project at the University of Washington, I think spearheaded by Richard Ladner. I'm sure there are others, but that is often my go-to in terms of they've really thought through the experience of studying computing, particularly in the high school and university years and where accessibility comes in. They recently put forward a nice set of seminars on different disabilities and coding education in the university setting, which I think is they're available online, is a very useful resource. I think interestingly, careers are accessible, but ironically, many of in the Microsoft context where I work, I have a very large number of colleagues who are blind, and they, like me, would have started when coding wasn't visual, when it was text-based, using things like BASIC. And they've had to adapt. And it's been an interesting discussion that we've had with them that as coding becomes more visual, it gets more complex. Although they can keep adapting their skills, there's a much bigger on-ramp for particularly young blind people who have to on-ramp very quickly to something that's highly visual. So there is research and some tools that are being developed. Microsoft is also developing tools, but we're still way behind where I think we need to be. But that's maybe also we need to deal with getting better screen readers before we even deal with some of the other stuff.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Should we go to one of the other groups for a question? Oh, Sean, you've got your hand up. Is that on that point, or shall I go to another group's question?
It's just on that point. I was just wondering if you could repeat the statistic from earlier in the presentation on the percentage of careers in the industry. I wanted to make sure I got it right.
Yeah, it is correct. People keep going, is that correct? It is correct. 1% of software engineers are blind or low vision. And I didn't put the reference in the presentation, but I do have it somewhere. We fact checked it before Microsoft was willing to go public with this. It's quite a large number, and I would say within Microsoft, I easily work with at least 40 different people on a fairly regular basis who are blind or low vision, and I know the community is actually quite a bit larger than that.
Great, thank you. Catherine, you said that Alex has got a question.
Because I found the idea of using that physical programming kit with children with cognitive disabilities or learning difficulties quite interesting, because I think even at the beginning of the secondary school, say year 7, 8, even 9, quite a lot of children found tracing and visualizing parallelized programs in block programming quite hard, because even when I program in Scratch, most of these programs run parallel scripts, and for them to imagine that without any physical representation is quite hard. So they find, for example, debugging difficult. So I wonder whether any research, or maybe there is some data on the use with cognitive disabilities.
Yeah, I don't have any sort of hard research data on it, but definitely experiences of people doing it. So we found, particularly in the schools for the blind, they tend to have children who have some level of cognitive impairment or cognitive difficulty, and they were using it. We had only used it up to the primary, but they were using it well into secondary with pretty good effect. It was always an important for a teacher to understand the context, because sometimes people said, oh, I'll just use it with my 14-year-old. And if that 14-year-old had been in a mainstream school and saw what their peers were doing, all of a sudden they were doing something very different, it didn't work well because of that social context. But we found even at a higher age level, it did work very well. It's just you have to make sure that it matches the appropriate social context. We also found that in the States, they've been using it. We know some people using it with adults with learning disabilities very successfully. So yeah, I think that the physical nature, and again, that ability to kind of physically orient your body and move your body really helps connect people to kind of what their code is doing. And one of the things I didn't talk too much about, but when people do follow it, if there's a bug, their hand is already on the pod that needs changing, so they don't have to then do that extra cognitive step of like, oh, where was the bug? Which line was it? What was it doing? It's like, I'm already there. I'm physically there, and I can physically change what I need to change. So it just takes some of that maybe motor sequencing and planning, which can be quite challenging for some people, out of the equation.
Great. Catherine, did you want to come in on that point? You've got your hand up on the...
Yeah, so I did, as some of you know, I did a survey of teachers in special schools in 2018 to see what was going on really in terms of computing, and the majority of them talked about physical computing as a really positive way of engaging and helping their learners understand it. So it's not an absolute, you know, this works, but certainly anecdotally they found that it was a really positive way of engaging children and helping them understand the key concepts was in terms of physical computing, and that was with learners with autism, with learning difficulties, with visual or hearing impairments. It was a large range of children. I'd like to follow up on it one day and actually get some, you know, real data on it, but yeah.
Anyone wants to engage with that, just let me know, because that's something we'd be super interested in.
Yeah. Lots of things we could, more research to be done. Hayley, do you want to come in with your group's questions, or did you have another hand up, different hand?
No, that's fine. I can do it. I think the first one that seems to have come up with lots of other people as well, so I'll definitely ask that one, is about how to support the transition from this to text-based coding. I think you showed us a bit about how, you know, you've got them to press them and they started doing the screen reader, but there was just a quite a lot of interest, it seems, from a few groups as to anything else that can be done for that support in the transition.
Yeah, so let me talk through that. So I guess this is something that people think about, going from block-based to text-based as well. So it's not only physical. So I know it's something people are thinking a lot about. We found that one of the main things that we were trying to tackle, and what we saw early on, was that when we saw how challenging it was for young children to kind of understand the relationship between lines of code, because they only experience them one at a time, it was perhaps the biggest challenge they needed to overcome was, how do I put a framework in my mind for the relationships of lines of code? And so one of the things that we thought about in the transition, that's probably one of the biggest things that we need to support through going through the transition. And obviously we're supporting that when the people are physically following their code, because they get a good sense of, okay, I'm in a loop, now I'm in a nested loop, I've come out, and their body is helping them to understand where they are in the code, and they have that overview, like they can physically feel the whole of their code, where they can't if they're accessing it with access tech. So what we tried to do is to take that experience in the video you saw, where they're doing that, they've already had, maybe depending on the child, 3 months to 2 years or whatever of physically using that code, and then taking that experience of, like, I deeply know what a loop is, and then trying to translate that to what is that auditorily going to sound like, and when do I have to clue in. So one of the things that we found in some of the students we work very closely with is we noticed 2 points where we knew we were going to get success. One was that they knew how to create nested loops, so they could get a sense of what was inside what and what ended. And then the second thing, and they were able to follow that. So they could create them fairly easily, but actually being able to follow them and knowing where they were was usually a good sign of that progress was going to happen, and pretty much everything after that was easy. And the other thing is we would ask them to speak out what they thought the code was. And unlike, I guess, the thing that's not there in the physical thing is that you've obviously got in an auditory experience, you've got loop blah, and then blah, 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 and then end loop. And that's not physical, right? There's no pod that's end loop. So we found that when they understood that they had to hit end loop, then they were very easily able to translate over to actually using text-based code. Because I think what, and again, this is more of our observation than anything else, was that they had sort of in their minds closed the loop of how things related, so they could chunk things in their mind properly, so that they were then able to move on. And again, I don't have any, we didn't do any research into transitions, but now many of those children that we worked with early on are transitioned into doing coding sort of at secondary and GCSE levels now. And again, we finding that concept of closure and a bucket, having put that concept in their mind, they seem to be able to quickly apply it to, say, functions or other structures that exist within within the code. So that was when we thought about transition, it was about really helping them make sure that they could identify the bucket and what bucket they're in, so that when they move to a linear experience of code, they could recreate that notion of bucket, and it seemed to work pretty well. So we didn't find that kids got stuck once they could achieve that end loop. From there, they kind of went, got it, okay, and off they went. It wasn't really a big deal. I mean, the bigger problem is the accessibility of text-based languages more than the transition.
Thank you. Can I just pop in another one, because it's sort of related. It's from Glenn. Can I do that? Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to do it anyway. It's sort of about this, that the extension and the transition and things like that is what the pods were, very good with sounds, and obviously that's a really useful one for children with visual impairments. But was there any other things that the pods could do?
Yeah, like the one we got asked, could I drive my robots with these pods, for example? Yeah, if you're a good hacker, it's easy. No problem. They can drive.
Glenn, sorry, I was just saying, Glenn, do you want to put your question better than me? It might be easier.
No, it's by that. I think you kind of hinted at it in the presentation, but I wanted to clarify, because obviously all of those are about music, but yeah, have you used it for other applications, kind of like, for example, making something physical move or that sort of thing? And obviously people with visual impairment, sound is, you know, one of the best things to do, but sort of physically moving an object or other stuff. Have you done anything with that, or is that sort of future work?
We've messed around with it, so we've actually hooked these up to Scratch so that you can program Scratch. We've done a bunch of stuff, but none of it's publicly available. It's just a but I can tell you it's pretty easy to hack. So anyone who enjoys hacking, go to it. It was more a decision of, you know, obviously a product has to be well supported and maintained and that thing. So for this particular community, sound was the best option, but there's nothing in the hardware design and its communication with the software that couldn't quite easily drive something else.
And what I like about it, although you use a lot of the music in the examples, Cecily, you can record your voice and make stories and that sort of thing. And so you can, you know, there's a lot of voice with it as well.
Yeah, we found it was a little bit more difficult in the trial, but in the product, you can record things really easily. So kids can record their own sounds, they can record stories. And these are actually really great ways to really push on the programming concepts. So for example, how much do you have in one bucket of a play? And how do you break that up? And it's very easy if you have one note to one pod, right? Kids learn to follow that really quickly, but all of a sudden you have a poem which is broken up in different ways. They have to start to really think about how those, even a very simple program of writing a poem is put together. And although, yeah, I really struggle with this because lots of people kept saying, can you drive a robot? Can you do this? We never had a kid ask us to want to do this. So it was really, yeah, we could do it. And a lot of coding professionals wanted to do it, but the drive didn't seem to come from the children. And maybe it's because of the children we were working with, because moving things are slightly less exciting. But we really tried to push on them, not so much, and this is, I guess, a very specific view, and I don't know if this is controversial or not, but there are some things you can create and create and create, but you don't really understand what you're doing. You don't understand the code. And we from the beginning, really grounded in that we wanted children to only create code that they could understand and only create code that was really going to push their understanding. So I don't want to just create a bigger program. Like lots of my colleagues were like, yeah, let's have 4 sets together. How many pods can you get together before the batteries go out, right? You know, kids didn't really want to go in this direction. It was their curiosity, and the curiosity of you could drive by these little changes that really push their notion of what sequences are. And I would really encourage teachers more in that direction. I think excitement comes from curiosity. It doesn't come from flashy things. They might be exciting to us, but I think what we found with the kids is that it really driving to the depth of like how complicated could you make a set of nested loops and really understand it, and how complicated could you make a series of threaded things, and to really push their understanding to the absolute max. And those are the kind of things, and often we would involve colleagues who are better than me at coming up with example programs. Those are the kind of things that they were really trying to do. Like, how could they really get kids to push the boundaries of those concepts? Because that's really where their learning took place.
That's brilliant. And there's some other interesting comments coming in the chat. I'll make sure I've been to every group. Jane, have I come to your?
You haven't been to us, but thank you for asking. But I think most of our questions have been covered. We were keen on the idea of loaning, and so Catherine was, we suggested about maybe hubs having learn kits, which Cecily, that's beyond you. But we were also interested in progression. So I think you answered that really about, there's certain design patterns or certain regions of interest, or what you call these buckets, that then can be translated into different genre and different tool sets. So I think you answered our question already, but we were really interested in the whole embodied idea. That idea of the physicality, and I think, yeah, it's such a shame that they lose that they go on to these other products and they no longer have, that's what a loop feels like, or that's what an if statement actually feels like in your body. So I don't know, can we change some of the kind of other programming languages to put it in there?
I don't know if Alex Havenbennet's on the call, but I guess he would be the expert in sort of dealing with this more deeply. But yeah, we definitely observed that very physical experience of, and I think the other thing that for me, and I don't have a lot of comparison of spending, you know, hours and hours of classrooms of children doing Scratch, but the physicality of engagement between two children. So we always designed all the way from the beginning of always having two children code together, which is a little bit more difficult on a screen. You can do it, but you always have that mouse battle and various other battles. And whereas the physicality of these things, it wasn't hard. Visually impaired children, for the most part, find sharing quite challenging for many reasons, but vision being one of them. And the fact that they could hold different things, like, it was very easy to direct and to manage that from a teacher point of view. It's like, okay, these kids are struggling. So you could either be like, right, you do that thread, you do that thread, or you could have like, okay, one would follow and the next would give. So one would be giving and following. So there were lots of ways that participation and joint working became very physical. And that was one of the things that I really noticed as, I guess it's not part of the coding experience, it's more part of that inclusive education, is that kids, regardless of their experience and their abilities, could really participate in really engaged ways. You didn't have a leader and a follower. You had much more nuanced ways in which they would work together.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I love the way with Torino, with Code Jumper, sorry, quote the wrong name, that you have a physical loop, you know, it goes around, you know, it goes around and go back to where it started, whereas if you're writing a, you know, on the screen, you're just at the bottom and you've got to go back to the top again. So I think that physicality is really good. I think we've got time. Oh, we haven't probably got time. I was going to offer one more question, but I think we've probably run out of time. So have we heard from everybody's group? I think we have. So can we say a big thank you to Cecily again? Hands and turn your mics off and say thank you or whatever. And actually don't turn all your mute buttons off yet until I've done my last little bit of housekeeping. So we would encourage you to chat about this on Twitter if you like Twitter. We'll save the chat and circulate it and Cecily's slides, and we'll be putting the recording on our webpage. So do still engage with this topic. We've got 2 more seminars coming up in this series. Next 1st of June will be Tom and Hayley. Hayley, you've heard from already today asking a question. It's the very same. Hayley is going to come and talk to us about some work we've been doing at Raspberry Pi. And on the 13th of July, we've got Ron Eglash, who's sort of very well known for his work on ethnocomputing. And then we'll have a break in August. So thank you very much for joining us. And so just to say thank you again to Cecily. Do say thank you with your mic's mute button off, on, whatever it is now, and or in the chat. And thank you very much from me, Cecily. We really enjoyed the seminar. Thank you.